The Big Bow Mystery by Israel Zangwill. Read by Adrian Pretzelis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Big Bow Mystery by Israel Zangwill. Chapter 3. Before the inquiry was resumed, all the poor wretches in custody had been released on suspicion that they were innocent. There was not a single case even for a magistrate. Clues, which at such seasons are gathered by the police like blackberries off the hedges, were scanty and unripe. Inferior specimens were offered them by bushels, but there was not a good one among the lot. The police could not even manufacture a clue. Arthur Constant's death was already the theme of every hearth, railway carriage, and public house. The dead idealist had points of contact with so many spheres. The East End and the West End alike were moved and excited. The democratic leagues and the churches, the doss houses and the universities, the pity of it, and then the impenetrable mystery of it. The evidence given in the concluding portion of the investigation was necessarily less sensational. There were no more witnesses to bring the scent of blood over the coroner's table. Those who had yet to be heard were merely relatives and friends of the deceased, who spoke of him as he had been in life. His parents were dead, perhaps happily for them. His relatives had seen little of him, and had scarce heard as much about him as the outside world. No man is a prophet in his own country, and even if he migrates, it is advisable for him to leave his family at home. His friends were a motley crew. Friends of the same friend are not necessarily friends of one another, but their diversity only made the congruity of the tale they had to tell more striking. It was the tale of a man who had never made an enemy even by benefiting him, nor lost a friend even by refusing his favours. The tale of a man whose heart overflowed with peace and goodwill to all men all the year round. Of a man to whom Christmas came not once but 365 times a year. It was the tale of a brilliant intellect who gave up to mankind what was meant for himself, and worked as a labourer in the vineyard of humanity, never crying that the grapes were sour. Of a man uniformly cheerful, and of good courage, living in that forgetfulness of self which is the truest antidote to despair. And yet there was not quite wanting the note of pain to jar the harmony and make it all human. Richard Elton, his chum from boyhood and vicar of Somerton in Midlandshire, handed to the coroner a letter received from the deceased about 10 days before his death, containing some passages which the coroner read aloud. "Do you know anything of Schopenhauer? I mean anything beyond the current misconceptions. I have been making his acquaintance lately. He is an agreeable rattle of a pessimist. His essay on the misery of mankind is quite lively reading. At first his assimilation of Christianity and pessimism, it occurs in his essay on suicide, dazzled me as an audacious paradox. But there is truth in it. Verily the whole creation groaneth and travaileth, and man is a degraded monster, and sin is all over. Ah, my friend, I have shed many of my illusions since I came to this seething hive of misery and wrong-doing. What shall one man's life, a million men's lives, avail against the corruption, the vulgarity, and the squalor of civilization? Sometimes I feel like a farthing rushlight in the halls of Eblis. Selfishness is so long and life so short. And the worst of it is that everybody is so beastly contented. The poor no more desire comfort than the rich culture. The woman to whom a penny school fee for her child represents an appreciable slice of her income is satisfied that the rich we shall always have with us. The real old Tories are the paupers in the workhouse. The radical working men are jealous of their own leaders, and the leaders are jealous of one another. Schopenhauer must have organised the Labour Party in his salad days, and yet one can't help feeling that he committed suicide as a philosopher by not committing it as a man. He claims kinship with Buddha too, though esoteric Buddhism at least seems spheres removed from the philosophy of the will and the idea. What a wonderful woman Madame Blavatsky must be! I can't say I follow her, for she is up in the clouds nearly all the time, and I haven't as yet developed an astral body. Shall I send you on her book? It is fascinating. I am becoming quite a fluent orator. One soon gets into the way of it. The horrible thing is that you catch yourself saying things to lead up to cheers instead of sticking to the plain realities of the business. Lucy is still doing the galleries in Italy. It used to pain me sometimes to think of my darling's happiness when I came across a flat-chested factory girl. Now I feel her happiness is as important as a factory girl's. Lucy, the witness explained, was Lucy Brent, the betrothed of the deceased. The poor girl had been telegraphed for and had started for England. The witness stated that the outburst of despondency in this letter was almost a solitary one, most of the letters in his possession being bright, buoyant, and hopeful. Even this letter ended with a humorous statement of the writer's manifold plans and projects for the new year. The deceased was a good churchman. Coroner: Was there any private trouble in his own life to account for the temporary despondency? Witness: Not so far as I am aware. His financial position was exceptionally favourable. Coroner: There had been no quarrel with Miss Brent? Witness: I have the best authority for saying that no shadow of difference had ever come between them. Coroner: Was the deceased left-handed? Witness: Certainly not. He was not even an ambidexter. A juryman: Isn't Schopenhauer one of those infidel writers published by the Free Thought Publication Society? Witness: I do not know who publishes his books. Juryman: A small grocer and big raw-boned Scotchman rejoicing in the name of Sandy Sanderson and the dignities of deaconry and membership of the committee of the Bow Conservative Association. No equivocation, sir. Is he not a secularist who has lectured at the Hall of Science? Witness: No, he is a foreign writer. Mr. Sanderson was heard to thank heaven for this small mercy. Who believes that life is not worth living. Juryman: Were you not shocked to find the friend of a minister reading such impure literature? Witness: The deceased read everything. Schopenhauer is the author of a system of philosophy, and not what you seem to imagine. Perhaps you would like to inspect the book. Laughter. Juryman: I wouldn't touch it with a pitchfork. Such books should be burnt. And this Madame Blavatsky's book, what is that? Is that also philosophy? Witness: No, it's theosophy. Laughter. Mr. Allen Smith, secretary of the Trammen's Union, stated that he had had an interview with the deceased on the day before his death, when he, the deceased, spoke hopefully of the prospects of the movement, and wrote him out a cheque for 10 guineas for his union. Deceased promised to speak at a meeting called for 7:15 a.m. the next day. Mr. Edward Wimp, of the Scotland Yard Detective Department, said that the letters and papers of the deceased threw no light upon the manner of his death, and that they would be handed back to the family. His department had not formed any theory on the subject. The coroner proceeded to sum up the evidence. "We have to deal, gentlemen," he said, "with a most incomprehensible and mysterious case, the details of which are yet astonishingly simple. On the morning of Tuesday, the 4th inst., Mrs. Drabdump, a worthy, hard-working widow who lets lodgings at 11 Glover Street, Bow, was unable to arouse the deceased, who occupied the entire upper floor of the house. Becoming alarmed, she went across to fetch Mr. George Grodman, a gentleman known to us all by reputation, and to whose clear and scientific evidence we are much indebted, and got him to batter in the door. They found the deceased lying back in bed with a deep wound in his throat. Life had only recently become extinct. There was no trace of any instrument by which the cut could have been effected. There was no trace of any person who could have effected the cut. No person could apparently have got in or out. The medical evidence goes to show that the deceased could not have inflicted the wound himself. And yet, gentlemen, there are, in the nature of things, two, and only two, alternative explanations of his death. Either the wound was inflicted by his own hand, or it was inflicted by another's. I shall take each of these possibilities separately. First, did the deceased commit suicide? The medical evidence says deceased was lying with his hands clasped behind his head. Now, the wound was made from right to left, and terminated by a cut on the left thumb. If the deceased had made it, he would have had to do it with his right hand, while his left hand remained under his head, a most peculiar and unnatural position to assume. Moreover, in making a cut with the right hand, one would naturally move the hand from left to right. It's unlikely that the deceased would move his right hand so awkwardly and unnaturally, unless, of course, his object was to baffle suspicion. Another point is that, on this hypothesis, the deceased would have had to replace his right hand beneath his head. But Dr. Robinson believes that death was instantaneous. If so, deceased could have had no time to pose so neatly. It is just possible the cut was made with the left hand, but then the deceased was right-handed. The absence of any signs of a possible weapon undoubtedly goes to corroborate the medical evidence. The police have made an exhaustive search of all places where the razor or other weapon or instrument might have had any possibility have been concealed, including the bedclothes, the mattress, the pillow, and the street into which it might have been dropped. But all theories involving the wilful concealment of the fatal instrument have to reckon with the fact or probability that the death was instantaneous, also with the fact that there was no blood about the floor. Finally, the instrument used was in all likelihood a razor, and the deceased did not shave, and was never known to be in possession of such an instrument. If, then, we were to confine ourselves to the medical and police evidence, there would, I think, be little hesitation in dismissing the idea of suicide. Nevertheless, it is well to forget the physical aspect of the case for a moment, and to apply our minds to an unprejudiced inquiry into the mental aspect of it. Was there any reason why the deceased should wish to take his own life? He was young, wealthy and popular, loving and loved. Life stretched fair before him. He had no vices. Plain living, high thinking, and noble doing were the three guiding stars of his life. If he had had ambition, an illustrious public career was within his reach. He was an orator of no mean power, a brilliant and industrious man. His outlook was always on the future. He was always sketching out ways in which he could be useful to his fellow men. His purse and his time were ever at the command of whomsoever should show fair claim upon them. If such a man were likely to end his own life, the science of human nature would be at an end. Still, some of the shadows of the picture have been presented to us. The man had his moments of despondency. Which of us has not? But they seem to have been few and passing. Anyhow, he was cheerful enough on the day before his death. He was suffering, too, from toothache, but it does not seem to have been violent, nor did he complain. Possibly, of course, the pain became very acute in the night, nor must we forget that he may have overworked himself and got his nerves into a morbid state. He worked very hard, never rising later than 7:30, and doing far more than the professional labour leader. He taught and wrote, as well as spoke and organised. But, on the other hand, all witnesses agreed that he was looking forward eagerly to the meeting of tram men on the morning of the 4th inst. His whole heart was in the movement. Is it likely that this was the night he would choose for quitting the scene of his usefulness? Is it likely that if he had chosen it, he would not have left letters and a statement behind, or made a last will and testament? Mr. Wimp has found no possible clue to such conduct in his papers. Or is it likely that he would have concealed the instrument? The only positive sign of intention is the bolting of his door, in addition to the usual locking of it, but one cannot lay much stress on that. Regarding the mental aspects alone, the balance is largely against suicide. Looking at the physical aspects, suicide is well nigh impossible. Putting the two together, the case against suicide is all but mathematically complete. The answer, then, to our first question, did the deceased commit suicide, is that he did not. The coroner paused, and everybody drew a long breath. The lucid exposition had been followed with admiration. If the coroner had stopped now, the jury would have unhesitatingly returned a verdict of murder. But the coroner swallowed a mouthful of water and went on. We come now to the second alternative. Was the deceased the victim of homicide? In order to answer that question in the affirmative, it is essential that we should be able to form some conception of the modus operandi. It is all very well for Dr. Robinson to say the cut was made by another hand, but in the absence of any theory as to how the cut could possibly have been made by that other hand, we should be driven back to the theory of self-infliction, however improbable it may seem to a medical gentleman. Now, what are the facts? When Mrs. Drabdump and Mr. Grodman found the body, it was yet warm, and Mr. Grodman, a witness fortunately qualified by special experience, states that the death had been quite recent. This tallies closely enough with the view of Dr. Robinson, who, examining the body about an hour later, put the time of death at 2 or 3 hours before, say at 7 o'clock. Mrs. Drabdump had attempted to wake the deceased at 7:15, which would put back the act to a little earlier. As I understand from Dr. Robinson that it is impossible to fix the time very precisely, death may very well have taken place several hours before Mrs. Drabdump's first attempt to wake deceased. Of course, it may have taken place between the first and second calls, as he may merely have been sound asleep at first. It may also not impossibly have taken place considerably earlier than the first call, for all the physical data seem to prove. Nevertheless, on the whole, I think we shall least likely to err if we assume the time of death to be 6:30. Gentlemen, let us picture to ourselves number 11 Glover Street at 6:30. We have seen the house. We know exactly how it is constructed. On the ground floor, a front room tenanted by Mr. Mortlake, with 2 windows giving on the street, both securely bolted. A back room occupied by the landlady, and a kitchen. Mrs. Drabdump did not leave her bedroom till 6:30, so we may be sure all the various doors and windows have not yet been unfastened, while the season of the year is a guarantee that nothing had been left open. The front door, through which Mr. Mortlake has gone out before 4:30, is guarded by the latch-key lock and the big lock. On the upper floor are 2 rooms, a front room used by deceased for a bedroom, and a back room which he used as a sitting room. The back room has been left open with the key inside, but the window is fastened. The door of the front room is not only locked, but bolted. We have seen the splintered mortice and the staple of the upper bolt violently forced from the woodwork and resting on the pin. The windows are bolted, the fasteners being firmly fixed in the catches. The chimney is too narrow to admit of the passage of even a child. This room, in fact, is as firmly barred in as if besieged. It has no communication with any other part of the house. It is as absolutely self-centred and isolated as if it were a fort in the sea or a log hut in the forest. Even if any strange person is in the house, nay, in the very sitting-room of the deceased, he cannot get into the bedroom, for the house is one built for the poor, with no communication between the different rooms, so that separate families, if need be, may inhabit each. Now, however, let us grant that some person has achieved the miracle of getting into the front room, first floor, 18 feet from the ground. At 6:30 or thereabouts he cuts the throat of the sleeping occupant. How is he then to get out without attracting the attention of the now roused landlady? But let us concede him that miracle too. How is he to go away and yet leave the doors and windows locked and bolted from within? This is a degree of miracle at which my credulity must draw the line. No, the room had been closed all night. There is scarce a trace of fog in it. No one could get in or out. Finally, murders do not take place without motive. Robbery and revenge are the only conceivable motives. The deceased had not an enemy in the world. His money and valuables were left untouched. Everything was in order. There were no signs of a struggle. The answer, then, to our second inquiry, was the deceased killed by another person, is that he was not. Gentlemen, I am aware that this sounds impossible and contradictory, but it is the facts that contradict themselves. It seems clear that the deceased did not commit suicide. It seems equally clear that the deceased was not murdered. There is nothing for it, therefore, gentlemen, to return a verdict tantamount to an acknowledgment of our incompetence to come to any adequately grounded conviction whatever as to the means or the manner by which the deceased met his death. It is the most inexplicable mystery in all my experience. Sensation. The foreman, after a colloquy with Mr. Sandy Sanderson: "We are not agreed, sir. One of the jurors insists on a verdict of death from visitation by the act of God." End of Chapter 3.